Good evening. I'm Janet Harris, President of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. As we continue our fourth of our eight-session series of Indiana Council on World Affairs Great Decisions 2026, tonight we hit on a topic that is this week's news. With the Trump administration's shift in United States trade policies by imposing tariffs, now our own Supreme Court has ruled that presidential authority has been exceeded. To introduce this evening's speakers is Dr. Betty Tonsing, Indiana Council on World Affairs Vice President for Programs, who, with council members, has organized this Great Decisions 2026 series. Dr. Tonsing.
Thank you, Janet. I am very pleased to introduce this evening's speakers. Jen Riccardi is an attorney who serves as a senior trade advisor in the delegation of the European Union in Washington, D.C. She's responsible for promoting the transatlantic trade throughout the United States. Her portfolio notably includes trade and services and investment, economic and national security, the aerospace and defense industries, and outreach to state and local governments. Prior to joining the delegation, Jen was the economic counselor at the Embassy of Luxembourg, ran a small consulting firm, and was a senior advisor for trade and investment at the British Embassy in Washington. From 1993 to 2005, Jen practiced international trade law at Dewey Ballantine. She studied political science and history at Fordham University and earned her JD from the George Washington University. And moderating this evening is our very own Dr. Pierre Atlas. Pierre, as you know, is a very popular speaker, and he also is a member of the board of our council. And he is a comparative political scientist. He is a senior lecturer in public affairs and criminal justice at the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Indianapolis, and is a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of the Middle East, Indiana University, Bloomington. And I already mentioned he's a fellow board member. You're in for a great evening. This is the topic of the moment, and we had a great discussion about it prior to coming on board, and I'm so glad you're with us. Pierre, would you like to start our evening?
Thanks, Betty. Thanks, Janet. And thank you, Jen, for joining us. I think, as Betty said, I think the timing is absolutely perfect. We couldn't have picked a better time given the Supreme Court ruling and last night's State of the Union address. I think a lot of us would be interested in just opening up by learning how you, as an American attorney, have become a senior trade advisor with the European Union. If you maybe just tell a little bit about how you got there and just in general what you do, and then we'll sort of get into some substance.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm excited to be here. I think it is extremely fortuitous timing that we picked this day and not last week to have this discussion. So when I was in practice, I was in a big law firm. Dewey Ballantine actually went spectacularly bankrupt after I left. They're no longer around, but they were a big white shoe New York law firm. And we were one of the premier trade practices. And I was enthusiastic and loved it. And then when my second baby turned 1, I had a 2 a.m. revelation that a lot of women in big law have, which is this was not working anymore. And to calm myself down, because I had to get in my NAFTA international arbitration brief in the morning, I started flipping through roll call. It was long enough ago that you still got print newspapers delivered to your desk. And I was literally sitting in the dark in my office at 2 a.m. with a single light shining down on my desk. And I'd been waiting for the angels to sing to tell me what I wanted to do next. And the light literally shined on a classified ad for the British Embassy. And the British Embassy said, we need, Her Majesty's government is looking for a trade and investment advisor. I thought, well, I can do that. And I can walk there from my house. The deadline had been the day before. And I thought, well, okay, they don't care as long as they get the resume by the time they come in at 9 a.m. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, for the first time in 13 years, I put together a resume. And 2 weeks later, I was working for the Queen. The Brits, it was a fun job. They have excellent celebrities. They know how to use them. People want to be invited to the house. I do feel like my career went off the rails at some point, though, because 20 years ago, when I was working for the British government, there was a young first secretary who was in my section. He did climate change. I did trade. Christian Turner is the new British ambassador to the United States. he just presented his credentials last week. So the guy that sat across the aisle from me as a first secretary diplomat is now the British ambassador, and I'm pretty much doing the same thing, but I enjoy it. I got recruited to come to the EU sort of through a circuitous path, but back when the US and the EU were negotiating a trade agreement called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, I was recruited to come join the investment negotiating team. So I came in 2015. In 2016, when Donald Trump won the Republican nomination, people kept saying, well, he's threatening to do tariffs, but he can't do that, can he? I kept saying, yes, he can. He has every power he needs in existing statutes to impose tariffs. So I wrote a note, a telegram, and I gave it a really bad name that I regret because we still use this note today, which was Much Room for Mischief, Trump's Tariff Threats. And I laid out all the statutory means that the president had at his disposal. And I sent it in August, and most people ignored it, both because they thought Mrs. Clinton would win and because it was August and more European. And I, come November, suddenly my phone started blowing up saying, hey, can you send me that note again? I think I lost track of it. And so this note has been floating around for 9 years now, whatever it is. And in January, when we had the second administration, I said, all right, first administration, he was fairly restrained in his use of tariffs. This time he's not going to be. I think he's going to use this statutory authority called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And I think it's going to be challenged in court. And if it's challenged in court, these are the arguments that are going to be made. And these are the arguments that I think will carry the day. And people kept telling me, no, the Supreme Court is in his pocket. But as we found out on Friday, on some things, well, this court is very business friendly. But this was a step too far for the court. The Roberts Court wanted to, I think, protect their legitimacy and their point of view. But that is a long-winded way of telling you how I got here. I noticed that when I was speaking, I said we, and I was referring to Europe. It is often confusing. I have an American accent, obviously. When I say we in this context, I'm probably referring to Europe. I will occasionally make an observation or a statement as an American. If it's not obvious from context, I will try to flag that for you. But I should be clear that when I'm speaking today, I speak only on my own behalf. I'm not speaking on behalf of the European Union, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the ambassador. Pierre, should I
Understood.
pull up those couple slides?
Yeah, and while you're doing that, I just wanted to ask, and I think you're going to be addressing this in your slide, but so the Supreme Court ruled that IEPA does not authorize Trump to do the tariffs, and I'm wondering if you can sort of go and talk a little bit about what that means. And also, I'm curious in your note when you identified the possible challenges, did that end up aligning with what the Supreme Court ruling was? I mean, in terms of where they found fault with tariffs and IEPA, did you identify what Roberts ended up saying, I guess, and how did that align itself?
It aligned. I was convinced that it would be on a statutory construction basis, just really vanilla analysis, and something called the major questions doctrine. But we can get to that in a minute.
Okay.
So I thought, let's see if I can actually manage to.
We see it. Yeah.
Did it switch? I'm trying to get it to go to the next page. They
No,
actually
it's
gave
still
me a
on the
whole
delegation
tutorial.
of the European Union.
Yeah. They actually gave me a whole tutorial in sharing my slides. Well, I cannot seem to get it to go to the page down. Let's see. There we go.
Right.
Since I'm a lawyer and since I hyped up all the various statutory means by which a president can impose tariffs, I wanted to start with that because I think it's the basis of our conversation for the next hour. I'll start with IEPA, which is what the Supreme Court just overturned, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This was passed in the late 1970s. It was to redefine the president's authority to regulate international economic transactions in a time of national emergency. IEPA allows emergency measures against an external threat only if a national emergency is declared under the National Emergencies Act with respect to that same threat. Now, typically, this act has been used a lot in the past, but it's been used to impose sanctions. It's been used to block transactions for specially designated persons. It was often used to extend export controls during the many, many times that authority for the Export Controls Act lapsed. Until last April, it had never been used to impose tariffs, in part because that is not an enumerated function under the statute. Nowhere in the IEPA statute does it say, when it lists the 16 things that a president can do, nowhere does it say you can impose tariffs. And that was the basis of the Supreme Court's opinion. We'll touch on that briefly in the next slide. Section 122 is the regime that we're under now. There is an executive order that issued on last Friday saying that from now on, because of a balance of payments problem, everyone around the world will be paying a 10% tariff. I anticipate that by Friday, there will be a new executive order that's going to raise that 10% rate to 15% for at least some countries. I don't quite have a handle yet on how the administration might differentiate between countries, but we have some intelligence which suggests that there would be a 10% rate and a 15% rate, and not everyone in the world will be treated the same. So Section 122 definitely says that the president can impose tariffs. You're allowed to impose an import surcharge of up to 15% for a period not to exceed 150 days unless Congress votes to extend that. A trigger is a balance of payment deficit to prevent the imminent and significant appreciation of the dollar, or to cooperate with other countries to correct an international disequilibrium. Do we have a balance of payment problems in the United States? Economists would say no, since we have a currency that floats. It's basically impossible for us to have a balance of payments problem. The United States is not having problems paying its debt. However, and because of that, I think legal challenges are likely to this. Especially since the president said that he's doing this in part to raise revenue, to replace the income tax. And that is not an enumerated reason under Section 122 to impose tariffs. I'm not convinced that a court would be willing to probe a presidential declaration that there's a balance of payments problem. And I also think it's very unlikely that you get relief in the short 5-month period that we're going to be under the Section 122 regime. But that it is being used as a bridge to other longer lasting tariffs, mainly those that you can impose under Section 232 and Section 301. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 authorizes the president to restrict imports that threaten or impair the national security. There's an investigation, so this is actually a process-heavy, law that's run by the Department of Commerce and the Department of Defense, which determines whether goods are imported in such quantity or under such circumstances as to impair the national security of the United States. So the factors that these agencies would consider include things like domestic production. What are the needs for defense requirements? Can domestic production meet that? What are the existing and anticipated availability of resources? What are the growth requirements for the domestic industries to be able to, support a future national security need? The report is issued within 270 days. It goes to the president. The president decides whether or not a remedy is warranted. We already have a lot of 232 tariffs, some of which go back to the first Trump administration. So there's a 50% tariff on steel and aluminum products coming into the United States. That tariff has been extended to derivatives made of steel and aluminum. So if you're bringing in a car part, you used to pay your IEPA tariff, now you'll pay your 122 tariff. Plus, you're going to pay the 232 tariff on how much steel is in that auto part that you're bringing in. There's also national security tariffs on automobiles and automobile parts, because we know how dangerous a BMW is, and on lumber, and on kitchen cabinets. I'm saying this as someone who's doing a kitchen right now. It makes me really bitter. So we're waiting for reports currently on semiconductors, drones, aerospace, heavy trucks. We've heard rumors that there will be new cases on large-scale batteries, cast iron and iron fittings, plastic piping, industrial chemicals, power grid equipment, and telecoms equipment. So I think the administration is really thinking very broadly about, how to cover a lot of products, a lot of sectors that they care about with tariffs. 232 tariffs are evergreen. It's much harder to litigate. There have been cases before that have upheld the ability to impose these tariffs. But I think you might see some litigation around the edges. For example, the auto tariff is based on a report from the first Trump administration. At some point, they probably need to refresh that research and determine is there still a national security threat, from this 10-year-old, piece of paper. I also think you might see some, challenges to the derivative products like the kitchen cabinets. Is there really a national security threat from a bathroom vanity? Section 301 goes against unfair trade practices. This dates to the Trade Agreements Act of 1974. It gives the president the authority to impose unilateral sanctions in order to enforce U.S. rights under trade agreements and to respond to unfair foreign practices. This investigation is undertaken, and once again, this is process heavy. And with both 232 and 301, it's also Administrative Procedures Act compliant in that there is a notice and comment period. You have your right as an interested party to come in to speak to the agencies, to issue comments about the proposed remedy and the problem at hand. So under Section 301B, the U.S. Trade Representative, who oversees this process, has discretion to impose sanctions if he finds that the act, policy, or practice is unreasonable, discriminatory, or burdens or restricts U.S. commerce. Unreasonable refers to acts that are not necessarily in violation or inconsistent with a U.S. legal right, but are unfair and inequitable. In making this determination, the USTR is to consider whether reciprocal opportunities exist in the United States for foreign firms. So many, many forms of relief are available to USTR under Section 301. It's an extremely flexible statute. I like to say that the punishment need not fit the crime when it comes to Section 301. So maybe Brazil is acting unreasonably to cattle imports from the United States. And you might think, oh, well, the US would impose a tariff against cattle imports from Brazil. No, you could go after anything. You could say you can't import salsa music. We're not going to issue intellectual property rights to your salsa musicians. It's extremely flexible, and you can go after services. You can prevent licenses from being issued. Typically, this hasn't been done. We saw the first foray into that last year in a case involving Chinese maritime subsidies to its shipbuilding industry, where the initial proposed remedy was a fee on cargo that was brought in on Chinese-built vessels. And for car carriers, foreign vessels anywhere. This was walked back mainly after China said, that's it, you can't have any more rare earths. The administration said, on second thought, we're okay with the subsidies. We'll work out that later. Once again, this is evergreen. It can last forever. It is harder to litigate. The bulk of the tariffs against China right now actually stem from a Section 301 investigation in the first Trump administration. So that was kept in place by the Bidens. It's just been going forever. I did just hear today that there was a court case challenging the Section 301 against China because what's called List 3 and List 4, which was the list of products subject to tariffs, were expanded in the Biden administration. And there was a court case filed against that saying you can't just keep expanding this forever. The plaintiffs lost at the Court of International Trade. They lost at the Federal Circuit, but they filed a cert petition on Friday, the day that the court ruled against ICWA. So there might be an additional Supreme Court case coming out. That is a 365-day review, but that's a deadline. It can happen much quicker. And I would guess that the cases that are coming are likely to take about 5 months, the period of time that we have 122. I think Europe is definitely going to be in the crosshairs for a few things. I would anticipate that there are cases against digital services taxes. I would anticipate that we have a case against Europe's digital regulation because big tech companies think they're treated unfairly in the EU because we make them abide by our standards. And you could see the remedy going a whole lot of different ways. I put another couple things up there. I think they're less likely, but they're good to note. 338 is ancient. It was in the 1930 Act. And it's somewhat similar to 301 in that it allows the president to impose duties on countries that have discriminated against the commerce of the United States. You can go up to 50%. You can prohibit all importation from a given country if they double down and keep discriminating against you after your 50% tariff. It lasts forever. There's no time limits. I think 338 is super interesting because it's been on the books and was basically forgotten. Every year, the Ways and Means staff publishes what's called the Blue Book. It is a compilation of all of the trade statutes that you as a practitioner need to know about. And 338 just dropped out of the Blue Book. Like literally, people forgot that it existed. And in the first Trump administration, when he first started threatening tariffs, a former USTR and a friend of mine, John Verano, actually published a blog post saying, "Hey, there's this forgotten statute out there that no one knows about." I'm like, John, no, don't tell him. But that's out there. We've had some people in the administration have threatened this. I understand that Peter Navarro has proposed using Section 338 to the president. It was proposed in the first Trump administration and was rejected at that point. But that could come back and that could be very ugly and things could get very ugly very quickly. Section 201 is what's called a safeguard. It's super, I don't think if a products are being imported into the country in such volumes that it harms the domestic industry, you can impose a tariff and other relief to help the domestic industry sort itself out. I actually worked on a case back in my misspent youth where I helped get Section 201 tariff on the steel industry to help out the US steel industry. They were my clients. It's often used for agricultural products. You see it for lamb, for oranges, for flowers. I don't think this is something that the Trump administration would go to, mainly because it involves another agency, the Independent International Trade Commission, has to make a decision, has to make a finding that the domestic industry is injured. And so he doesn't have the control he wants, and it takes a long time. Finally, Section 891 is another one of those sort of forgotten provisions of law that troubles me, and I could see it popping back up. Section 891 of the Internal Revenue Service Act permits the president to double the U.S. taxes of any foreign nationals or companies if the president finds that U.S. citizens or corporations are being subjected to discriminatory or extraterritorial taxes. And that's just suddenly, boom, okay, EU, France, you have a digital services tax that charges taxes to, foreign companies in your country, and US companies disproportionately pay that. Boom, the US taxes of all French companies in the United States are doubled. We've been very wary of this. We're keeping an eye on Section 891. I don't think it's particularly favored by the administration, primarily because both the Treasury Secretary and Congress don't like it. They're a little bit wary of it. And so I'm not convinced it's actually going to pop up, but I flag it because you never know. Before we leave the tool, the robust tariff toolbox, I would just note something that tariffs is something the president has wanted for a really long time. Back in 2011, in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, he proposed a 25% tariff on all imports from China. Right? This is something that's been in his brain for decades, and he finally gets to do it, and he's going to do it. So, it's a brave new world with tariffs. So, Supreme Court ruled Voss selections, learning resources and Voss selections v. Trump. It was argued in November. Decision came out Friday. It was a resounding win for the plaintiffs. It was a 6-3 decision. Written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Supreme Court ruled that Congress did not grant the executive the power to impose tariffs using the ICWA authority. 3 of the justices, no worries, Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett also relied on something called the major questions doctrine. The bulk of the major questions doctrine was actually used. It's an invention of the Roberts Court. It was basically used a lot in the Biden administration to overturn economic programs that Biden wanted to do. For example, it was used to overturn student loan debt forgiveness. It was used to overturn some climate change rules. And major questions doctrine basically says if there's something with a really big economic impact on the U.S. economy, Congress has to be really crystal clear that they are telling the president, you can go do this. The liberal justices didn't join that because they don't think major questions doctrine is a thing. Like they didn't want to use it. They've never joined a major questions doctrine. The majority of the opinion was actually a knife fight between Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh over what the major question doctrine is, how it should be applied, whether it should apply to questions of foreign affairs. And then there's a really strange dissent by Justice Thomas, which basically said Congress could give away its taxation authority, that's fine. And Gorsuch kind of gutted him in his opinion, saying, no, that's just insane. Court left a lot of open questions. The main opinion itself is like 15 pages. It's pretty crisp. The main two big questions are left. Refunds. $170 billion or so have been collected in tariffs. Supreme Court didn't say anything about who gets money back, how people get money back. And that's already has moved on to the lower courts. Tuesday, the litigants actually filed at both the Federal Circuit and the CIT saying, give us a process. Refunds should be super easy. The Customs and Border Administration uses what's called ACE. It's an electronic system. Before your goods ever enter, you've already paid a deposit. It's done electronically. There are no paper records or paper checks. It is, written down column by column, like what the tariff is, like what column the tariff was paid under. If the administration wanted to, they could very, very easily return all of those tariffs paid that were ruled illegal. They don't want to. It's going to be a slow process. They're waiting for the courts to tell them what to do. I am confident that most people will get their tariffs back. You'll probably have to file a lawsuit at the CIT to get it. You'll probably have to spend money on a lawyer. People are going to get their money back. Well, of course, what's interesting is the importer of record will get their money back. You and I, who may have paid a tariff on a kitchen cabinet or a good at Walmart, we're not going to see that refund. And that creates an interesting political dynamic, I think, both for the administration and for the companies, right? And so we're hearing rumors that there's some quiet conversations going on with big companies where the administration is telling people, do the patriotic thing. Don't file for a refund. Whether or not that's true, I don't know, but it rings true to me. The other thing that has been thrown into question by this is all the bilateral agreements that have been reached, including with the EU, where people negotiated on the basis of the ICWA reciprocal tariff. There is no tariff authority for the president to impose tariffs. You have this, what would typically be considered a congressional executive agreement without the benefit of Congress, affecting the tariff schedules. And there's a lot of people are looking each other's side eye. Is there a independent legal basis for the bilateral agreements? Huge split in opinion on whether there is. I think there probably is. Once again, a personal opinion, not an EU opinion. I think ultimately how all these bilateral agreements get resolved, because under the Section 301 power, a statutory remedy is negotiating a deal. I suspect that there's the European Union Section 301 investigation, which is resolved by a deal that looks a lot like what was agreed bilaterally in Scotland, but we're not there yet. And we'll come back to the whole EU thing. The new tariff plan, as we discussed, is Section 122 as a bridge to 232 and 301 investigations. There's going to be more litigation. I thought it was really interesting that in this, as we come up to the midterms, there's such a discussion right now about affordability. And the Supreme Court offered the president an off-ramp, right? They offered him a way to back down from tariffs. And honestly, the administration was already starting to do so. I had mentioned that the steel tariffs, for example, apply to downstream products. Well, they had this open process where every quarter they just said, tell us if you think your downstream product should be included in the steel tariffs. And domestic industry would come forward and be like, yeah, my widget should definitely be included on that list. And then they were. They pretty much all you had to do was ask and you got the tariff. They've slowed down after the last, and they had said, we're going to do this at once a quarter. They never announced the results of the one in the fall. They didn't hold one in the winter. And I think it was a real, there was an understanding that tariffs are starting to affect investment, that tariffs are starting to affect affordability, and that tariffs were affecting the domestic production goals of the administration. I don't know if we're still going to see that dial back on Section 232 tariffs, because I think the president is really smarting after the Supreme Court decision. And sorry, I'm trying to make this go to the next one. I'm really bad at this. I apologize. Okay. I wanted to throw this slide up briefly, and I think we'll return to this later in the conversation, just to put a little bug in your ear. On the left is a map of all of the countries with which the United States has a trade agreement. There's about 20 countries, other than the NAFTA countries or USMCA countries. They tend to be small economies. They tend to be smaller countries. It's, Jordan and Israel and Australia and a couple places in South America, the CAFTA countries. It's about 20 countries altogether. The EU, on the other hand, has trade agreements, and these are full trade agreements with more than 70 countries. India is currently colored in yellow there. They should actually be moved over to blue, because we concluded the trade agreement with India. And this isn't a bilateral trade agreement or a reciprocal trade agreement like the US is negotiating. It took 20 years. This is a full-on, all chapters, traditional trade agreement that we reached with India. The EU is moving ahead full steam with its trade liberalization agenda and its adoption of free trade agreements. In Canada, the Canadian Prime Minister wants to broker the EU's joining of what's called CPTPP, the Comprehensive Transatlantic Trade Partnership. The TPP was negotiated by the Obama administration. It was the big Trans-Asia deal that Trump blew up on his first day in office. If the UK joined it last year, if the EU were to join it, it would be a really, really substantial trade area with really a substantial amount of trade that the US would not be a part of. So I say that as I go into my next slide. I'm so sorry. I'm really bad at this. There we go. Why does it matter? The transatlantic traded agenda is huge. The relationship is huge. For the moment, it is the largest in the world. 30% of global trade, 43% of global GDP, and almost $2 trillion in two-way trades and goods and services in 2024. The 25 numbers should be out next month. Creates huge numbers of jobs, huge amount of investment. And one thing I like to do, because I think it's really hard to conceptualize, to comprehend just how big $2 trillion is. My ambassador always likes to break it down, so I'll break it down a little bit. That's about $5.5 billion a day, $228 million an hour, $3.8 million every minute, and $63,000 every second of every minute of every hour of every day in a year. It's an enormous sum of money that's at risk. And it's an important relationship. We think it is a relationship that is worthwhile to preserve. And we're doing our best to find a positive agenda to keep it going. So Pierre, I will stop there, and I'm sure you have some questions, and I'll see if I can stop sharing. There we go.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. That was incredibly informative. It really also explains for people who are sort of following the news since the decision, a lot of those numbers of different trade options, tariff options are being thrown out in the media, and you really gave us a nice snapshot on all that. I do have a couple of just general questions just coming off of what you were saying. One of the things that Trump has been saying literally from day one about tariffs, and he said it again last night at the State of the Union, was that the foreign countries are paying the tariffs. The exporting countries are paying the tariffs, which of course isn't the case. But what I found really interesting was, you're pointing out with the possibility if there are going to be refunds, the refunds are going to go back to the American companies that imported this stuff. And it doesn't sound like even anyone in the Trump administration is saying that these refunds should go to China or France or whatever. I mean, does any, I guess it's not, I don't know, I'm trying to frame this into a question, but clearly Trump doesn't understand how trade works or tariffs work at all. But it does seem that everybody in his administration does. So how do you sort of explain this disconnect and this idea that how is he still making this argument that foreign countries are doing it? And can you sort of explain, you know, what happens here and how American and European businesses are being impacted by these tariffs?
Sure. I consider this as sort of the tariff equivalent of Mexico will pay for the wall, right? And so, yes, the importers of record are liable for the tariff. Um, to be fair, there was some tariff sharing. Like I have seen some deals between the ultimate purchaser and the importer of record where there was a tariff sharing arrangement that was all on the domestic side. In the early days, before things, when there was sort of initial panic and people thought, oh, this will just last a few weeks and then we can move on with it, lawyers told me that they did have some exporters coming to them to basically get advice for how much can I fudge the landed price so that I absorb some of the tariffs. So there was probably some tariff sharing between manufacturers and importers, at least early on. I don't think there's a whole lot of that happening now. Early on, you also saw importers absorbing tariffs, like particularly in the auto industry.
Yeah.
That's not sustainable long term. So I think what we're seeing uh, from the US side is there are people, this is really hard because it's not like you can change the supply chain on a dime. If you're making something like a, personal protective equipment, a mask, yeah, you can change that pretty quickly. You can set up domestic production really quickly. Something like the aerospace industry, you can't, which are currently 0% tariffs because Boeing and Airbus got together and browbeat the administration and said, you will ruin the aerospace industry to the benefit of the Chinese plane that no one wants to fly in. Um, like literally every screw that goes into an airplane is certified by the Federal Aviation Administration for being airworthy, and airworthy certificates are specific to manufacturer and place of manufacture. So you can't even change the where you're making, the piece of metal that goes into the plane from one factory to another. So you can't even like game the tariff system that way. I think what you saw early on from in China, particularly as China was uh, has been subject to these tariffs the longest, is supply chains moved. So, and I think that's why there's a lot of really upset people in places like Vietnam and Cambodia and other lower labor cost places where production moved from China to these countries, often with Chinese investment. But it's now a product of that other country, and they're now subject to tariffs sometimes that are higher than what's being paid um, by the Chinese, which I don't think answered your question of how are companies dealing with it. I think you're seeing a lot of impacts in real time. I was actually this afternoon, I was at an event for the state international development offices. These are the economic offices that go out and recruit foreign direct investment and recruit, help their companies export. And at this event, I asked several of the states that were there if they'd seen an investment impact yet, right? Because this was the other reason rationale for the tariffs was we're going to
Yeah.
bring investment to the United States. We're going to have a manufacturing renaissance.
Reshoring. Yeah.
Yeah, that there'd be reshoring. And every single one of them, including very red states, said they had not seen any tariff investment bump yet. And maybe that makes sense because investment does not happen overnight. It is planned over a long term. But you're planning over a long term because you have a stable and predictable environment, to put that money
Mhm.
in. And so what they were telling me is where they saw the drop off was investments that had been pre-planned pre-tariffs. So, whether it was an expansion, and I've heard anecdotally so many stories now of an existing foreign inbound company that had planned to expand their US footprint and saying that because of tariffs, they had to rethink that plan. We were going to put in 4 lines. I got board approval. We were going to have 200 new jobs. Because of the steel and aluminum tariffs and the tariffs on robotics and machinery, I had to go back for more money. My costs are now 25% higher. The board turned me down. I'm only putting in 3 lines. right? You know, that
Yeah.
I'm hearing lots of stories like that. So I don't think that the promise of tariffs is paying off in the way the president hoped that they would. And you will see some foreign investment. And, we just had some announcements from Japan. Any of this, sovereign foreign wealth funds, anything being funded by governments, yeah, you'll see some splashy investments, and you might see some sectoral investments, particularly in semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. I don't know that you're going to see a whole lot of investment out of that, and indeed, some people are withdrawing from the market. So,
So that leads me to go a little bit deeper into this, which is the whole question of uncertainty. Long-term investment from any type of business, you want to have a sense of certainty. And not only are the tariffs creating more uncertainty, but one of the things that really we sort of saw, and you sort of hinted at this earlier. I mean, initially after the decision against the use of IEPA, Trump said we're going to 10% across the board, and now he's going to raise it to 15%.
mhm.
It isn't just the tariffs, it's the fact that the numbers keep changing over and over again. I had someone who works for a businesses in Europe, and he told me I told him we're gonna be doing this, and he told me that some of the businesses he works with, they actually have to know exactly what time of day the product shipped from the countries, because sometimes when the ship is at sea, the tariff rate changes. And depending on what the tariff was when it left the port, that's going to be the tariff they're going to be charged. And it can actually change literally while they're at sea because the
Yeah.
Trump administration is changing it so much. So it isn't even a question of there's now tariffs where there weren't tariffs before, but he'll just get up one morning and change the numbers. And I'm wondering at the level of that kind of uncertainty, how does that affect negotiation, especially like you're talking about negotiation with the European Union and the administration? There's a lack of uncertainty, but also it seems to me that sort of undermines the trustworthiness or even a good faith negotiation if it can change. I mean, what have you been seeing?
Well, I think that, this is well covered in the news, right? So, um, take Canada. The president threatened to impose additional tariffs against Canada because he didn't like an advertisement that a provincial governor ran.
Yeah.
Um, the president threatened tariffs against some of my member states because they said they would stand up for Greenland. That they would respect the territorial integrity of their fellow member state, Denmark. Um, it makes it very hard, and it's going to make it very challenging if we still have bilateral agreement in the end of the day. I have constituents too, right?
Hmm.
And and I think one thing this administration forgets when it's America first outlook is that all of their trading partners have constituents too, to which we have to answer. And so the first deal the deal that we struck, the deal that we have now, it wasn't even blood for water. It was blood for nothing. Like we bled hard. We traded a lot away for the privilege of having our average tariff rate go up from 3% to 15%. And in exchange, we said that we would let lobsters from Maine enter tariff free, and would reduce the tariff on industrial products for the United States to zero. And that was a real mental gymnastics for the EU because we've always been a big proponent of a rules-based order and the WTO. And the WTO says you have to charge everyone the same rate, if they're MFN. And so we had to get through a lot of stuff mentally, like to get there. But I also have to get it through Parliament. And there are already people in Parliament who don't like the United States. There are people in Parliament who definitely don't like the United States after the Greenland threats. There's constituents who question whether the EU's interests, we used to say we trade with the US because we have shared values, because when you export, you don't just export goods, you export values. And there has been some real criticism and questioning in Brussels and in capitals over whether that's still legitimate and true.
Hmm.
And that's a hard conversation, right? That's a really hard conversation to have. Um, and because of that, my chairman, Brent Long, the chairman of the International Trade Committee of the Parliament, said, we're freezing this deal. We're not implementing it. We need to understand, we need to have clarity on what the deal is, and we need to have certainty. because we agreed to 15% tariffs because businesses said we need predictability, we need stability, and we can make 15% work if we know that that's the number. And
Yeah.
almost immediately, as soon as we agreed that, it was, oh yeah, also digital regulation. We don't like your Digital Services Act and your Digital Markets Act, because Zuck called me and complained about it and he got fined. And so we need to do something about that. Well, that was not part of the deal. That was expressly left out of the deal. And so this mission creep is extremely problematic for the EU. I know it's problematic for the UK. It's been very problematic for Korea, who's trying to, once again, on the digital regulation side. Um, and so my parliament, I think they're thinking about how can they, for lack of a better word, Trump-proof this agreement. If we go forward, we'd say, okay, we'll give you 0% tariffs. How can we make sure that we actually can safeguard the benefit that we bargained for? And so we're considering some things in the legislation. There might be a standstill clause saying that, our tariff concessions will be withdrawn if there are new tariff threats made against us, if there's new 301s or new 232s. Steel and aluminum, the derivatives are extremely problematic. It's the number one thing that businesses complain to us about, both in Washington and in Brussels.
Yeah.
And so we've been saying that we're working on a solution, and we might include a clause in there that's saying if we don't have a solution to the steel question, and we do want to work with the United States on overcapacity. We think that there is an overcapacity problem in the steel market. We say if there's no solution in 6 months, we might withdraw these tariff concessions. And finally, we're talking about a sunset clause, that, the tariff concessions would expire in 2028, as with the lobster concession. And so those are some of the things that we're doing to try to think about how can we future-proof this agreement.
Yeah.
But I think the US needs to recognize that we all have our problems. We all have constituents.
It's interesting. I think it was last week. I gave the Great Decisions talk on U.S. Trump's foreign policy and how sort of America first is undermining the liberal international order of 80 years, and part of that is economic, but the sort of the taking on of fellow democracies, the loss of soft power, the loss of the sense that we have shared values, treating our strongest European and Canadian and other democratic allies at the same level as if they were our enemies, in this zero-sum competition. We're America's losing a lot of its cachet. I mean, I think you really identified a lot of the details in terms of even trying to make a deal. And here Trump loves to talk about making a deal, but he's undermining his ability to make deals because he constantly he acts out of pique. He gets upset and he does something, or someone has his ear and he'll change the policy on a dime. But all of that on top of the fact that basically we are undermining our leadership, and our attractiveness. And that sort of leads me. I'm looking at the time here. I have a question I want to ask you about Brexit, but before we get to that, I want to know what is, to what extent has you said you pointed out all these different trade agreements that the European Union has, whereas the U.S. is really kind of far behind. How is the European Union looking at China now? And is it looking at China differently because of what's been happening in the past year with the United States?
I would actually say no, and that surprises people. So China has always been, we've always had a slightly different approach to China than the US has. Like our phrase was always, China is a partner, a competitor, and a systemic risk.
Hmm.
And it depends upon what you're talking about when to say which of those three buckets does China go into. Over the course of the last 5 years, I think, the union has really fundamentally thought about China and the risks of China to the single market and to the European Union. And so you're starting to see, a different approach to China, that's a little more in line with the US. We passed a bunch of legislation, that could be used and has been used against China. So we have something called the foreign subsidy rule. So we already have rules against subsidization, in the market, and making sure that the member states don't subsidize, and, that all is fair. But this was a special rule that said we can actually look to see if a third country is subsidizing. If there's an investment offer to buy a homegrown Belgian company, and was the offer sweetened by outside money? Is that an unfair competition? We created 5 years ago for the first time a national security investment review system. Um, uh, sorry, a national security investment review system, which was similar to the U.S. CFIUS process, which asks, like, do we really want every investor is a good investor? No. Often we're more worried about Russia than China, but I think both of those two investors are on par. And we have something that it's funny, called the anti-coercion instrument, which says if a country attempts to coerce us economically to achieve a goal of that country, there are a range of tools which Europe has to respond. And many people thought that this was a China-specific rule because it was adopted shortly after China punished one of my member states for having the temerity to open a Taiwan affairs office in their capital. I like to remind people that we also adopted the anti-coercion instrument in the first Trump administration.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I don't,
Yeah.
and well, definitely China was the headline. I think a lot of people foresaw that there could be a time where we needed to use it, against the United States. We've never used it. I think we realize we need to keep our powder dry. We need to make sure it is effective and works. There are a lot of people who are really interested within the service I work for in exploring its use. So,
Interesting. Interesting. Wow. That really sort of, yeah, that's kind of a sobering statement, actually. Um, well, I know that we're gonna move over to questions from the audience for you to engage with the audience. But before that, I have a question that's always interested me, and that is about Brexit. And I'd really kind of like to get the European Union perspective on that. Now, not only about Britain leaving, but I teach a class on terrorism and public policy, and one of the cases I look at is Northern Ireland. And so the whole question of Brexit, with when the majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to stay, and the UK left anyway, and there's been questions about, to what extent might that even down the line destabilize the Good Friday negotiated settlement that ended the Troubles, and all of this. I mean, what uh, from the European Union's perspective, a couple of questions quickly. How has how has it gone? I mean, what type of relationship does the European Union have with Great Britain now? And are your thoughts on the hard soft border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? If you want to get into that, I'd be curious to your perspective on that.
so I was actually at the delegation when the Brexit vote happened, and my ambassador at the time was Irish.
Hmm.
And after the vote, I've never seen more stunned people in a room. Like literally, we had a meeting where people were just crying.
Wow.
It was inconceivable to many that anyone would want to leave the union. And now we know a lot about the disinformation campaigns that underlay, a lot of
Mhm.
that decision. Um, and maybe it makes a bit more sense. One of the reasons why the divorce settlement took so long was because the union was committed to preserving the Good Friday agreements and peace in Ireland. And in order to do that, we had to make sure that Irish goods could still enter the Republic, Northern Irish goods could still enter the Republic of Ireland. That was such a significant, opening the border was such a significant part of the peace process that we
Yeah.
were not willing to let that go. And so I think Britain badmouthed us a lot, saying we were dragging it out and making it harder. Well, we did that for a reason. We did that at the request of Ireland, and we did that because ultimately the union is a peace arrangement, right? That is the ultimate
Yeah.
goal of the European Union is peace on the continent. Um, I do think Brexit actually had a benefit for the union in that it really helped refocus hearts and minds on why we were in a union. That it was not simply commercial, that there were other benefits to it. I suspect that the current relationship with the United States might lead to a fundamental reassessment of Europe's relationship with North America. And once again, this is just me. This is not an
Mhm.
official line. Um, but when you think about it, like we've been such good partners because we're reliable for each other, right? We're security partners, we're economic partners, we're intelligence partners, and all those things are gone now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We're still economic partners because we're in bed, and it takes a long time to get divorced, but it- I don't think there's the same level of trust that there was. It's going to be very difficult to come back from this, and I suspect that in 3 years' time, there's going to be sort of a reckoning of countries around the world saying, do I stick with the US? Do I go with China? Is there a third option? I'm hoping Europe's the third option. And it's hard for me to say that as an American, but
Yeah.
I suspect that could be the way to go. If we have stable rules, if we have low tariff rates, if we are treat people fairly. Um, that could happen. That might be the new polarity that happens. I think the real question is can we get our act together on defense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because the security relationship is very important. That's another reason why we agreed the deal, like Ukraine, like we need the US. But we're trying hard to meet our spending goals and to meet the expectations of the US, and we are in terms of NATO contributions. We've committed a lot of money to buying armament. But now we're being criticized by the US for adopting Buy Europe provisions. We learned at the feet of the master, right? We learned that
Yeah,
from the
no, it's, yeah,
US.
I mean, why not
So
Europe first, right? I mean, if we have
yeah,
America
yeah,
first, then,
yeah. And
um,
so,
yeah,
we're in for interesting times.
very
I'm
much
I'm
so.
so ready for precedented times.
So before, I'm going to hand it off to Ray in a second to run the
Yeah.
Q&A. I will just maybe a final last question on this note. So Canada is America's largest trading partner, and clearly North America has this incredible relationship, which has been cast asunder, I think, thanks to Trump. You sort of hinted at this, but I mean, do you envision Canada really reorienting itself away from the United States and towards the European Union? Um, yeah, also with Greenland and everything. But what's
I
happening?
think I think Canadians are voting with their feet, right? The number of the tourism
Yeah,
numbers have cratered.
gone down.
The,
Yeah,
people, Canadians aren't coming to Florida. Canadians aren't visiting. Canadians aren't buying US products. This was not a government-led campaign. This
yeah.
was organic Canadians who were so upset and so hurt by the way they were being treated.
Mhm.
And so there is a massive renegotiation coming up this summer. The USMCA, what we used to call NAFTA, is up for a renegotiation this year. I suspect Trump will say we're leaving as a negotiating tactic. I don't know that Canada can decouple because the economies are so integrated. And as an
Yeah.
American, I'll say we are so lucky that our two immediate neighbors, the two neighbors with which we share borders, are stable and good economic partners, without standing armies. Um,
Yep, yep, yep. No,
so
absolutely. Yeah. No, and I mean, I've studied Canada for a long time. I did my undergrad there, and this is something that I have a lot of Canadian friends and family, and it's like a nightmare scenario. I mean, who could have
yeah.
a year ago, everything that we've talked about a year ago, I don't think a lot of this was could have been foreseen. I mean, maybe with the first Trump administration on tariffs, but the burning bridges with our Democratic allies and partners
Yeah.
and brothers in arms in so many ways, literally just burning it to the ground is just something that is a very yeah it's tough to see. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and hopefully
I
the
did
audience
too.
did as well. And I'm going to pass it on to Ray because it looks like we've got a few questions in the
Yeah.
chat, and I'll let Ray take care of the Q&A.
Thanks, Pierre.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much, Pierre. Jen, thank you so much for those insightful responses to Pierre's questions. We do have a few people that have some questions out there. Deb Myers, actually, I think you started to address her question, but Deb, you want to kind of elaborate a little bit on what you were thinking?
Thank you very much. You started to touch on this. Uh, Not explicitly tariffs, but those involved in hospitality have suffered due to decreasing visitors from elsewhere. Speaking as an American, what can be done to mitigate this?
Wow. Invite your friends and loved ones. I don't know. I mean, people vote with their purse, right? And I think there's not only the sort of organic movement of there's lots of other great places to visit, but there's the administration, because of the immigration situation, is making it a very unattractive place to visit. There have been a number of stories of citizens of other countries who had their ESTA, who had their right to visit the United States, were swept up into an ICE encampment or were detained for weeks at a time. And those stories get a lot of press attention in Europe and have generated a lot of concern. Um, I don't know. I'm sorry, Deb. I don't have a good answer for you. But I think, once again, I think it needs to be time. Like we need to lobby our elected officials to say it's not a great idea to demand to see every visitor's, social media. It's not a great idea to, stop processing student visas. You're all academics, or many of you are academics, and we're seeing that on the ground of there's just flat out they're not giving appointments to even process visas. So
All right. Well, thank you. That's a complicated question. I'm actually planning a trip to Canada in the fall here, and I'm kind of wondering what kind of reception we're going to get while we're up there. So it should be
Canadians are
interesting.
lovely and they will be lovely to you.
All right. Okay. Renee, you have a question?
Uh, Tariff rate is subject to WTO regulations. Uh, Underdeveloped and developed countries are given the edge to impose tariff to promote industry in their own country or region. With this fact into mind, should the US compare their tariff rate with the tariff rate of the developing or underdeveloped country?
Are you asking if the US should differentiate between developed and undeveloped countries, so sort of consistent with the WTO?
Exactly as the WTO, they have given some relaxation to develop and underdeveloped country, and they can have the higher rate of tariffs. But I see once the Trump was showing them, he was not discriminating the different countries. As India is an underdeveloped country and so many other countries, you can't put high tariff rate on their. They are already, the struggling country to come to the developed country. So, being developed country, US, should it compare their tariff rate with the developing or underdeveloped countries? My question
I
is
think
technical.
it's interesting because that was actually one of the specific concerns that the Trump administration has with the WTO is with developing countries and the fact that you can self-certify as a developing country and get the benefits of being a developing country. That's their beef with China. Frankly, that's their beef with India, because India has some of the highest tariff rates, in the world, including particularly in agricultural products. And so not answering the question of should the US do it, but are they? No, never. And in fact, when you look at some of the tariff rates of the ridiculous, poster board that he had on Liberation Day, the developing world was really hit with the highest tariffs from them. So should the US take a moral stance? Yes. Will they? No.
And there's another, I just share my observation. I'm the PhD student. My like somebody's talking about the economies, like America or the Europe. They have the service industry as the Nokia company is the Finnish company making cell phone, and the Chinese is the manufacturing industries there. They don't have a very strong service industry. Service industry is as the Apple phone is, they have all the license or the authority or the benefits come to United States because the Apple company belongs to US. Same about the Nokia company belongs to Finland. And the Chinese, if we see the at the macro level, they are only doing the producing job. The actual beneficiary of the trade, the free flow of the trade, what is the philosophy of the WTO is there. Actually, the beneficiary is the Europe or the US itself. If they are getting the cheap labor and some cents, you are paying some cents to the labor. Why the in the Europe and the Americans, their investors or their the big bosses, they prefer China working because ultimately the China is not the beneficiary. They get some cents. Ultimately, the if the Apple sale is increased to the world because Apple phone is not only sold in United States, it's sold in all the world. The beneficiary are
I
the
agree with you.
Americans.
I agree with you, and I think that actually raises a really interesting question, which is, um, Apple got this huge tax break, right? They got exempted from the semiconductor tariffs, because of a personal relationship between the CEO and the president, and a promise to invest a lot of money in the U.S. That investment is not going to be in production because U.S. doesn't have skilled labor. We don't have the labor, the skilled labor to actually manufacture a cell phone assembly. There's actually, a handful of plants that are super specialized in that can do that kind of work. I totally agree with you that, you know, the president is looking at these questions backwards, but I don't think logic works on him, right? He's going to bring manufacturing back, even if no one wants those jobs.
All right. Well, thank you, Renee. Claire Collins, I think you're up next here.
Yes, thank you. I haven't been to Canada since before the pandemic. And I was wondering about filling a prescription at a Canadian pharmacy. Like if a person were to go to Canada and get a prescription filled, would you have to pay a tariff on the way back, or could you conceal it in your suitcase or a pocket, or would you get frisked on the way back? And can you when you're individually moving stuff about, would you have to pay for that? And then also, I was thinking, I had heard recently about a Chinese-made car, a hybrid car that might be less than $10,000. If I were to go to Canada and buy a really inexpensive car that was from China originally, and then come back to the US, would I have to pay a tariff on that?
The answer is yes to all of those things. So we used to have what was called a de minimis exception for tariffs, which said if it's less than $800, you don't have to pay a tariff on it. It was basically a recognition that the paperwork cost everyone too much money to make it worthwhile to collect what at the time was like a 3% tariff on a small dollar value good. It just didn't make sense. You'd spend more than $30 of people's time to collect that tariff. The president got rid of the de minimis exception. It caused like chaos with Federal Express and DHL last year, when suddenly you would buy something online and someone had to pay the tariff on it. So yes, you would be obligated to pay the tariff on the pharmaceutical product. Um, I'm getting a little out of my depth here because there might be an exception for personal pharmaceuticals, but I do not know. Do not quote me. I cannot advise you to hide the product and smuggle it. And the BYD, you would owe a tariff on it. BYD, it's fast. I was in Lima last summer, and I was like in the back of a cab, and I'm looking around, like, I don't recognize any of these cars. And I finally realized they were all Chinese. China has absolutely taken over the South American auto market. It's fascinating. The BYD electric car is apparently very good. It's getting a lot of gaining a lot of ground in Europe. You would not be able to import it into the United States, however, because there's something called the connected vehicles rule, which says that Chinese manufactured cars and certain systems in Chinese manufactured cars that are capable of collecting data or are capable of permitting control of the car remotely render them dangerous, and they cannot be to the US, and they cannot be imported. So no BYD for you.
Oh, gee. One more question about the pharmacy. Suppose you go to, say, go through Detroit and go to Windsor and get a prescription filled there, and give them your address and make arrangements to get an automatic thing come through the mail. Does that get stopped at the post office that you'd pay for your prescription, the tariff for that?
Um, it should, honestly. I mean, once again, I'm hesitating because there's something in the back of my mind that thinks there might be an exception for pharmaceuticals. I'm just not positive. You could, I mean, there are a lot of mail order pharmacies in Canada, and I'm sure there's information on their websites about the effect of tariffs. A lot of stuff from Canada is actually tariff free right now. So about 85% of all products from Mexico and Canada actually fall under the NAFTA exception and we're not taxed at IEPA rates, and will not be subject to the 122. So if your pharmaceutical product is a NAFTA qualifying good, you won't pay tariffs on it anyway. I would go to one of the online pharmacies and ask that question. They'd know better than I do.
Another question about the BYD. That was very interesting about the security issues and the automated, um, whatever. And um, if a Canadian citizen wanted to just come for a week-long vacation, would they have to not drive their BYD, or would they have to rent a car? Would it be completely unallowed to have a BYD even temporarily in the US?
They would have to get a special license to bring it in. You can get temporary licenses to bring in cars subject to the connected vehicles rule if it's a temporary entry, or if it's for like showing off at like an auto show kind of thing. But you actually have to get a special license from the Commerce Department in order to bring it in. So
But it would be forbidden for a US citizen to buy the BYD from a Canadian citizen here in the US.
you could buy it, you just couldn't bring it over the border
Oh, gee.
without getting into trouble.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Thank you, Claire. Again, I'll just remind people, if you have a question, please post it there in the chat and I'll call on you. While we're waiting, I do have a question. There's 200 some odd countries in the world. Going back to your list of different options for creating tariffs for various countries, it seems like you would have to kind of use all of those individually with all those 200 different countries. How is that even, feasibly possible for kind of people in the administration to kind of go through that convoluted process of saying, well, we're going to use this rule here for this country and this rule for that country. It seems like a very cumbersome process.
Well, USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative's office, actually did not lose any personnel to Doge. But they're already thinly staffed. There's like 240 people that do the U.S. trade policy. I actually, this is my theory. There's something that is published every year called the National Trade Estimate. And this is a book of sins. This says these are all the things that U.S. companies have complained to us about what is unfair that we should work on around the world. And so I don't know if all 200 countries are in there, but any country with an economic relationship is, and how, what the US is in there. And it might say, the section on the European Union is like 80 pages long. It lists regulations they don't like. It lists, from everything from content streaming like Netflix to agriculture to SPS issues to industrial goods. My guess is, even though there is a 365-day process for Section 301, that is a country-specific statute. My guess is the investigation portion will be taking the National Trade Estimate, which USTR publishes, putting that in the record, saying, here are all the things that Bolivia does wrong. Here are all the things that Germany does wrong. Here are all the things that the European Union does wrong. And that'll be the basis to launch either a tariff remedy or negotiate a settlement with each individual country. Clearly, they're going to have to prioritize. I think they probably start with the big markets, like me, and get to the smaller ones later. But you're right. There's the huge resource issue right now, particularly given the number of departures from federal service.
All right, thank you. Pierre, I think you maybe had another question or two that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I had so in one of the things that's part of your portfolio, Jen, that in your bio is aerospace and defense industries. And I'm wondering, given the new tariff regime and uncertainty, whatever, how do you think this might impact on the U.S. relationship with NATO? I know you're focusing more on the European Union, but there's a lot of sharing of this. How is that being impacted by the tariffs? Is it being exempted? And I mean, how do you think this might impact just overall and sort of the future of the U.S. relationship with NATO?
Um, I don't know that tariffs are going to be what undoes the relationship with NATO.
Yeah.
The uh, one thing that's interesting is about 80% of all defense spending in Europe is spent in the United States. So
Hmm.
when Poland buys fighter, like people want American tech, right? And so already there's a huge flow of money coming to the United States, whether it's to get Anthropic or Palantir or Northrop Grumman or whatever it might be. Um, Europe understands that they need to build their own defense base, right? And this is actually going to lead to frictions with the US. We're still going to be buying that tech because it's really good, but we want to make sure there's something homegrown. Like right now, there's about to be a fight over space. Um, Europe
Hmm.
is considering passing a law about satellites in space. We want to fund a low Earth orbit because we don't want to have a situation like Ukraine in the early months where Elon Musk turned off access to Starlink for Ukraine. Now he's turned it off for Russia, and we're okay with that. But we didn't like we didn't like it when he turned it off for Ukraine.
Right.
Um, and we are looking at buying, supporting our own low Earth orbit network so that each country and the European Union could have secure control over their own communications and their own fate. Amazon is also launching a new low Earth orbit satellite system called, I think it's called Leo. It's been through a few name changes, that wants to compete with Starlink and wants to take over the European market.
Hmm.
I can't tell you how many times a week I get browbeaten by someone at Amazon
Hmm.
because Europe wants something for its own security and safety. Like we're
Interesting.
doing what the president told us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that leads when I'm not sure to what extent it is today in 2026, but one of the issues, the one weaknesses of the European Union for years was lacking or the inability to get a common defense policy and a common
Mhm.
foreign policy. It sounds like the EU is moving more in that direction.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. We
Because of
definitely
Ukraine, I
have
guess.
adopted a common defense policy. And we are uh have moved to fund and help member states fund their own defense. Some of the member states, particularly those that share a border with Russia or with Ukraine, are really, really ramping up both the number of people and the services and the types of hardware that they have. We're also really sending tons of armament to Ukraine,
Yeah.
and so have depleted, stockpiles and need to re-up
Yeah. Yeah.
those piles. So,
Interesting. Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I see there are a bunch more questions, so I'm going to pass it on again.
okay.
Thank you. All right.
Larry Chimino, you got a question there, Larry?
Yeah, I'm just curious. You mentioned how cordial Canadians are when people visit, and uh, actually, I visit quite frequently and attended the same university as Pierre did in Canada. But I'm curious because I do travel internationally, and I haven't been out of the country for a while now. Are we seeing the kind of retaliation against American citizens visiting countries that sort of tit for tat versus what we see, some of these things that we hear, some of these things that are happening to people who come here. And I've heard some of the same horrible stories about, what happens to people and they get put into the ICE system and what have you. But I'm traveling to Hong Kong in a few weeks, and I'm just curious if we've heard anything about hassling Americans that come to visit in other countries when after we impose these tariffs and create all kinds of problems with them.
I have not. I've been out of the country probably 4 times since the President Trump was reelected. And I haven't had any I haven't noticed any problems. I do travel on an American passport. My French is terrible, despite being a Rotary exchange student. So I know you guys were talking about the Rotary earlier. Um, I haven't seen that. I've traveled in Asia, I've traveled in Europe, I've traveled in South America, and everywhere people have been kind and welcoming. I don't know, maybe they talk behind my back, but that could be. But I also think, if you know how to travel, you're respectful to the country you're visiting, that will be returned in kind. So,
Okay, thanks.
sure.
Okay, Claire actually had a follow-up question real fast here, Claire. We're kind of getting to the witching hour, but go ahead.
Okay. Um, can you hear me? Yeah, I got the mute buttons off. Back to the BYD. Is there a technology that allows you to disable the security controls that China has, and in order to import it into the U.S.? And also, is Canada concerned about the security issues with the BYD, and also the UK and the EU? Are they importing cars from China?
So I'll start with the question. So in terms of disabling things in the car, that was actually a proposal made to the Commerce Department. The Commerce Department said not good enough. The types of systems that they're worried about are things that are pretty integrated into the car and control operations. So things like LiDAR systems that lets you, like, the car know where it is in space around other things. And even something as simple as like the Apple CarPlay, anything that integrates your phone into the car system. Because then someone could conceivably, theoretically have access to your contacts, where you go, who you call, and could decide if you were a person of interest. I think, for most of us, the Chinese aren't going to care. Maybe if you live near a military base, they would. The EU does permit Chinese cars to come in. We're limiting it. I think our car manufacturers are starting to see the threat. And so we've responded with other more traditional tariff remedies, like a countervailing duty, which says countervailing duty says, this has been around for 100 years. If you unfairly subsidize a product, I, as the importing nation, can impose a duty to take away the benefit of the subsidy from you. It's not fair to say a German car manufacturer who doesn't get subsidies has to compete with a Chinese car, which is heavily subsidized. And so there are some adjustments that way. We recognize the risk of the connected vehicles risk. We don't take the same approach of an import prohibition. Instead, we are going through cybersecurity protocols. And we think we can control any of our concerns through using cybersecurity. We actually just published a paper on it last Monday. I've been carrying it around for a week and haven't read it yet. But
Thank
Right.
you.
sure.
Thank you. That's an interesting issue that we need to deal with here. All right, I think we're getting close to our closing time here. So Jen, thank you very much, and Pierre, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Betty to kind of close us out. Thank you.
Hey, Jen, thank you very much. Pierre, that was great with questioning. And Jen, you really were the person who could provide us the best expertise. And we want to thank you very much. Your schedule is really tight, and I would imagine it's going to get even tighter. But thank you, and thank you all for your questions. It's very well informative. I guess we won't know what we don't know what he's going to do until he does it, and that uncertainty, and yet the stock market just keeps doing what it's doing, which of course he's relying on that. He keeps pointing to the stock market as a proof that he must be doing something right. Um, Real quick question for me, just having brought that up, do you have any concern that the stock market one day is going to go, we're done, we're finished, this is not good, and we'll just go into a major correction?
So the one thing I was anticipating, I thought the Supreme Court was going to rule the way they ruled. I had been convinced by an economist friend that the bond markets would react, because the bond markets would be worried at this loss of revenue from the US government. And there's not the stock markets actually went up a little bit on Friday because, like, hey, tariffs.
Right.
Bond markets remained rock steady. And so, eventually is there a floor? We've seen it a couple times, like the markets reacted when Trump goes overboard, right? When tariffs were first announced on April 1st, the stock market crashed. It recovered because he cut all the proposed tariffs in half. When he threatened Greenland, the stock market reacted. And I think because it was a step too far. I don't think he's done with Greenland. I think, much like in 2011, he said he wanted to impose tariffs. He's going to hold on to that. And Denmark's in for a hard time. So,
Ooh, yeah. Well, as I tell my friends, we all have to find our lane. And because there's too many lanes, there's just too many lanes. And our heads could spin to the point they could fly it off. And to keep our heads, we have to choose lanes and trust that other people are covering other lanes. And we'll see what happens. It's going to be a very interesting year, isn't it?
it will be.
Yeah,
It will be.
be. Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to thank you to our audience for coming this evening. As always, you are wonderful. And we particularly like your questions. I think that's my favorite part of what we do. And it's what we've always done. We have always had our public Q&A has always been your opportunity to ask our speakers a question. And we don't intervene in that. And I think that makes us really unique. And we appreciate that we've never had anybody. I think this happened before my time where people started one off and found a platform. But we had to bring out the cane, but it worked okay. And I know we kind of worried a bit when we went with because of COVID. We went virtually. Thank heavens that Zoom was right there to accommodate all this, but it did not happen. But I love the public Q&A because we never know what you're going to ask. Your questions are not vetted. So, and you've been wonderful. I want to remind you that next week, we are going to be in our first week of March. And you know that the Great Decisions series is an 8-week series. Janet, just a second. Get to that. I'll get to that journal or that book. It's an 8-week series, all of February and all of March. Okay, hold up that book. This is our turn. We want to ask you to please, the articles in this journal or in this book are really, okay, fabulous. Thank you, Pierre. Any other board members that have got their book? Mine is downstairs. I can't run down and get it. They're wonderful articles. They're well written. They're well researched. And I tell you, they are good books to keep, good journals to keep for future reference. If you're going to be doing any particular studies, they are also well documented. So if you want to go to other sources, for someone who's an academic, that's extremely important. So you have other sources. But they're very interesting articles, covers a great bit of detail, and it's credible. It's informative and it's credible. These are not blogs by people who have an axe to grind about a particular issue. These are well documented and credible. And that's what we particularly pride ourselves on, is providing those forums that you can trust. We don't want to be biased. We want you to come in and inform your own opinions, what have you, on the information that's credible for you. Next week, our program is going to be U.S. engagement with Africa. And our speaker for next week is going to be Dr. Catherine Ntiamoa, who is the Director of Policy Engagement and Strategic Partnerships at the Indiana University's Hamilton Lugar School. And the moderator will be someone who used to be a board member as well, Donald Cassell, who is a senior fellow at Sagamore Institute, which is an Indianapolis-based think tank, and Donald directs Sagamore's Africa portfolio. So it's going to be a very interesting program, 52 countries in that teeming continent. And people are not right now paying too much attention to Africa, and they may regret that. Because Africa is teeming with its own resources, and it'll be really interesting. I'm looking forward to that. And with that, we say good night.
Thank you for having me.